All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next session with Heartset Training Center. Our friends Ryan and Khalil are here, and I'm just going to turn it over to them since they know what they're doing. And let's see what kind of conversations we can have today.
Thanks so much, Laura. Hi, everyone. It's great to be back with you. This is part 2 of this series. Just as a reminder, if you've been attending these little noontime training sessions since January, we've been around doing different topics, and it's a new topic each month. So a 3-part series each month, and we're in part 2 here, building trust and compassion, harm reduction, and the therapeutic alliance. So we're really excited to be back here and to kind of dig deeper into some of the challenges that we see in providing service in this way, and how do we enrich our relationships as like the cornerstone of the work that we do. So I'm Ryan. I use they and them pronouns. I'm one of the co-founding trainers of Heartset Training Center. My background is in mental health and co-occurring disorders, and I've worked in both harm reduction and housing first type settings. So that's the lens that I bring to these conversations. I'm excited to be back. I'll let Khalil introduce himself as well.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Khalil Martin. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I'm excited to be here and talk about harm reduction and therapeutic alliance. I think separately, these are really cool things to talk about, but also together, I think there's a lot of benefit from this conversation. So looking forward to it.
Yeah. I will say, um, somebody gave me an amazing compliment last time we met, which was that my voice is an audiobook voice, right? Like they could imagine me narrating an audiobook. And so I'm now quite self-conscious about how I speak, but also I'm on the lookout for those job opportunities. So yep, keep sending them my way. Um, here are some expectations that we have and that we hope you'll share with us for this session. We want to hear from you. We want you to talk. We want you to be engaged as much as possible. I know that's a little tougher in this webinar format. So, but please feel free to put your, open up your chat box and really kind of use it as a stream of conscious for your thoughts. Push back on things if you don't agree. We're recognizing that disagreement is a kind of a valuable learning process, and so we want to kind of engage with you in that way. So even if you don't agree with what you have to say, please put it in the chat. And if you do, put that in there too. We want to hear everything. We will sometimes have to move us along just to kind of make sure we hit all of this content. We have a ton of stuff that we want to cover in this 1.5 hour session. So if we do move us along and we seem to be quite a little bit in the middle of a discussion, uh, just hoping you don't feel um, upset by that, but it's just for the purpose of getting through the content. And then finally, we are going to be sending out copies of the slides after the session and a session evaluation. In the chat, we'll drop a link to that. So just hoping you'll offer some feedback and look at the materials that we send you. I think they'll be useful in your kind of continued learning journey. So you can look out for that from us. I haven't sent out last week's session materials yet. I'll do that as we wrap up the session today. So you'll get both of them. Alrighty. Here's the objectives that we have for this session. By the end of this 1.5 hour long session, we want you to be able to describe some of the harms that are present in traditional models of care or modes of care, ones that are not harm reduction focused. We also want you to identify at least 2 ways that the myths of accountability, of enabling, and natural consequences may sometimes damage our client relationships. Right? These are concepts that we're probably all familiar with, and yet they play this insidious role in the work that we do if we're not careful in damaging that therapeutic alliance that we're going to focus on. And then finally, we want you to be able to identify 3 approaches to repairing damaged client relationships, or perhaps preventing that damage in the first place. So we'll outline a couple of things. Here's how we're going to get there. We'll start with a very brief review from last session, in which we really kind of laid the foundation of our perspective on harm reduction. And then we'll explore some gaps that exist in kind of what we call traditional care, maybe more abstinence-focused care. Then we'll dig deeper into some of the cultural scripts that I think inform the work we do. Those examples are accountability and enabling, and rock bottom, these things that really are present in the work, especially of substance use and risk type care. Then we'll take a look at some of those strategies for repairing and preventing broken relationships, offer some key takeaways, and hopefully we'll have some time for some quick Q&A. So excited that you're on this journey with us. Here we go. For a review, we talked last session about the ways that harm reduction is effective when we're wanting to reduce the harm associated with risk writ large, right? We wanted to make sure that we got across that risk behaviors are not just substance use, although, of course, we know that harm reduction is really tied to these ideas of substance use. But we think it's broader than that, or it can be applied more broadly than that, right? So the many harms that are possible at the intersection of risk and care, we wanted to highlight, right? And some of those harms that are present include the stigma related to certain behaviors and related to certain identities, right? Certain people receive more stigma than others for the same behavior, right? I don't think we made this example last time, but the very common example that's a little bit old and dated now is that, for example, in the criminal legal system, cocaine use and possession was dealt with more harshly than crack, right? Though it's the same drug, right? Different populations of people using it, different stigma there, different harm. Another and related concept that we talked about is that shame harms people. And so in this care context, when we are having discussions with people about their behavior and about what they're doing and how they're living, we have to be quite careful to avoid conversations that include shame. Shame is going to cause people to go into hiding, not share with us, not be open with us and transparent about what they're doing and how they're living. And that's always going to increase the harm, right? When people hide, that's more dangerous. Another concept that we talked about here, another harm, is that people, especially in our settings, are quite likely, maybe 100% of the people that we serve in our settings, are dealing with either kind of current, recent, or developmental long-term trauma in their lives. And it's very possible to do this kind of work where we try to only focus on the present, right? What are you doing now? What are your behaviors right now, without uncovering a bit of what's behind the story, right? Why are they doing that? And what are they trying to survive, right? That trauma. And so when we're not addressing trauma as a component of care, we are likely not mitigating some of the ongoing harm that's possible in our care settings. So we think a harm reduction is an antidote to those harms. We also think that we're using it every single day, all of us, right? There are risky things that we all do every single day, and we find little ways to reduce harm, right? Driving a car is not safe on any day of the week, but we do it because we have to. And so we mitigate some of that harm by trying to keep our speed down, by wearing seatbelts, by not texting and driving, right? These are some ways that we can reduce harm in that not always safe thing that we do. Finally, the two main goals of harm reduction, why we think it's such a good antidote to those harms, is safety and bodily autonomy, right? So really wanting to encourage people, develop systems to protect people, to keep them safe, while also allowing them to make decisions over their own lives, while allowing their self-determination to be at the forefront of their decision-making processes. We went over these harm reduction principles. I think I went through them pretty quickly, and I'm not going to dig too deep into them now. The one that I want to highlight for the purpose of this review section is that harm reduction is participant-centered. Now, most of us would probably say that our work is client-centered or participant-centered in some way. But with harm reduction, just really wanting to emphasize that the therapeutic relationship is at the center of the care model, right? We know that everybody's going to have their own strengths and needs, and those are going to require individualized intervention strategies. And so just centering that for the purpose of this discussion today and next time, because we think the Therapeutic Alliance is maybe one of the most important ways that we can show up with people. Finally, we know that there are outcomes and limitations related to harm reduction that are both good and challenging. one of the outcomes of harm reduction is that we're going to be able to meet some of the key needs that people have, even though they engage in high risk behavior, or maybe because they engage in high risk behavior. And ultimately, you've heard us probably say, and you've heard it elsewhere probably, that somebody can't recover if they're not alive to do so, right? If they're not alive. And so harm reduction saves lives by allowing people to be safer. Finally, there are a number of limitations related to harm reduction. Maybe we are uncomfortable with people talking about their risky behaviors. Maybe our lived experience is so far removed from the person that we're serving that it's tough to engage in direct conversations about those risky behaviors. Maybe we're too worried about the criminality, the illicitness of the risk behavior that's present. Perhaps it's tough for us to avoid the fixing reflex, where we bring our savior complex into the relationship. And then lastly, our personal values may sometimes get in the way, right? I don't agree with what you're doing. You shouldn't be doing that. It's immoral, things like that, right? So those are some of the limitations. It's mostly stuff that we bring to the table. And then as a last slide on this review kind of section, just wanting to emphasize again that we talked about the way that there is a relationship between when people experience trauma, they subsequently engage in health risk behaviors, and that there is research literature around that. And the reason we're bringing this up again is that relationship is often a thing that suffers broadly when people experience trauma, right? Perhaps it is the relation a person's most close relationships that are the source of the trauma, right? Perhaps when people engage in risky behaviors or substance use, that's the conflict point that damages relationships and enables people, or disables people from accessing support. And then finally, when people are experiencing trauma, they're impaired kind of emotionally and mentally from allowing themselves to be vulnerable, right? There's an adaptive response where people are kind of closing off and protecting themselves. But that is causing them to not be able to access the kind of support that would be necessary to move through that trauma. Khalil, I think, are you unmuted? Did you want to add anything to this? I'm not sure. Maybe I think you wanted to talk about trauma here too, and I want to give you an opportunity if you had something to add.
I don't think I have anything to add right now.
Oh,
Thank
great.
you. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So the last bullet point here on the slide is that we talk so much about stigma and shame, and just wanted to kind of emphasize that stigma and shame are going to be great impactors, negative impactors of relationship, right? So all of this just gearing us up to highlight the importance of relationship as a healing tool, as maybe one of our key interventions as care workers, and the way some of these things can get in the way of that. All right, I will kick it over
Awesome.
to you, Khalil.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So Ryan shared that some of the traumas in our lives actually exist relationally, right? In relationships to other people. I experienced this really bad thing because somebody did something to me, right? Is what that might sound like for you or for clients that you've worked with. Um, so the point of the therapeutic alliance is to tap into that idea, right? That relationships can be traumatic and probably have been. And that's some of what makes engagements with the folks that we serve and work with in our service settings really difficult sometimes. So it's important that to be able to engage in harm reduction work, specifically a healthy and supportive relationship with the folks that we're working with who are often super stigmatized, um, is supportive. It's important that the work with these folks is as supportive as possible and that relationship feels safe and secure to them. If there's no relationship, honest conversations about risk behaviors like Ryan was sharing are less likely to be shared, right? We're not able to intervene in the ways that we might be able to if somebody felt comfortable and safe to just be sharing what they're doing. So that's what we hope to start talking about and breaking down is how do we preserve a relationship that just feels good for folks and continue engaging in through a harm reduction lens. This is a quote that we really appreciate. I think it brings in many views into the idea of harm reduction and also um, paints a picture of why relationships might be important. It says that systemic racism fuels the opioid crisis just as it contributes mightily to other areas of health disparities and inequity, especially for Black people. We must ensure that evidence-based interventions tailored to communities are able to cut through the economic and social factors that drive disparities in substance use and addiction to reach all people in need of services. And it might surprise you, but some of those evidence-based ideas do revolve around relationships. And we have some of that data to share with you in the course of this specific session. But just we appreciate this quote because it loops in many of the communities that we serve, right? Homelessness, substance use here. There are some racial disparities mentioned here as well, which all kind of play a very cyclical role when it comes to being in relationship to one another. So typical modes of care. Ryan talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but these are going to be the options available to us now, maybe more often. These are going to be the modes of care that we know and are familiar with. Many like rehab centers, housing and recovery centers. Um, there's a word I'm looking for. Oh, recovery houses is the actual word I was looking for. Spaces like this that are based on a linear residential treatment model, right? They might have a level system or be merit based. You need to do X, Y, and Z or prove this number of days of sobriety or great behavior in order to move on to the next thing or the next set of privileges or the next little bit of independence we might give you, right? A lot of these also take place in congregate settings with 24/7 staff. Um, like I said already, compliance and rewards play a major role, right? You prove this, then you get this reward. Um, and they're often very abstinence focused. Um, here's what you get if you maintain abstinence, right? So it's important to know that the merit-based and like level systems that these agencies and organizations are set up um, to align with aren't actually evidence-based or data-driven, not empirically anyway. Um, so I think that goes to show like the idea of like reward. Maybe housing shouldn't be a reward, right? Or um, safety shouldn't be a reward for folks. And then yes, so these buckets on the bottom are kind of what this is based on. And this is very individualistic and personal, right? They center on the ideas of perfectionism, only one way um, to do the recovery thing that they're doing. It's very black and white or either or thinking, right? You are sober or you're not. And it's very paternalistic and revolves around the idea of control. Um, typically. But what we know is that this leaves some folks behind, and often is upholding themes of dominant culture, right? Where people who are winning will continue to win, and people who are losing might even be pushed down even further. Which brings up some ethical dilemmas. Are we doing the best we can do to support folks who are asking for services and we're not giving them to them, or we're not supporting them in whatever recovery looks like to them because they're not willing to be completely abstinent or won't stop smoking weed or won't sign this one document, right? A lot of small barriers that sound a lot like the because I said so that we like to talk about. You need to do this because I said so. And that not being a very trauma-informed way of approaching care or services for folks, and also super harmful for just relationships in our lives. What I like to tell folks is to think about the last time you did something you didn't want to do. Whether that was like a responsibility task or a care task for yourself. There's some things you might do begrudgingly, like drive to work or cook a meal. But when it comes to receiving things that are need-based, right? Oh, you can sleep in your bed if you do this thing. That's not how this works, right? We're talking about very basic and physical needs for folks, important needs for folks. Anything to add here, Ryan?
The thing that's sticking with me as like you're talking right now is just the ways that it's very easy to. I'll emphasize this. Abstinence-based care is really working for many people, right? And so we don't mean to step in here and say that abstinence-based care is wrong, but when we offer care in those ways, those buckets at the bottom are kind of centered, and it's very easy to feel and internalize that sense of failure if this doesn't work for you, right? And so it just prolongs and makes more chronic these challenges that people are already experiencing. So it makes it tougher, and it opens. We often talk about like there are gaps in care, or like the system has gaps in care. It's here often, right? It's here in this way where we're not filling up all the possibilities of ways to meet people where they're at. Um, and so what happens and so I just want to very quickly look at some of the ways that those gaps in care show up for people. People start to disengage, right? People start to see that folks within the system are not going to meet them where they're at, or like the programs are not designed to help them, right? Especially drug users. Um, and so people sort of that internalized stigma makes people feel and see that there is reduced opportunity for them to be independent, to be able, right? To be an able person, that I can do for myself, right? When people's autonomy is stripped from them because it's like you have to do it this way and there's only sort of one path, that lack of choice is really disempowering for folks, right? And further entrenches that stigma cycle that we talked about last session. And so what's going to happen there is people are going to sort of actively participate a little bit less. They'll sort of do what you say they should do when they have to, but otherwise they're going to disengage a bit, right? And it's going to result in a worse therapeutic relationship with the worker. Often this comes through in like from prior experiences in care settings. So even if you're doing your best, right, to meet somebody where they're at and to be in good relationship with somebody and to not be so kind of either or paternalistic, people walk in with the trauma of other care settings, right, which makes it really hard to actually engage people. Um, and if there's anything that reminds folks of the setting that they were previously in that was a failure for them, that's going to make it your job even tougher. We often see some disengagement through breached trust and disappointments, right? If we don't show up and do everything we said we were going to do, that's broken trust, and to rebuild from that is sometimes impossible, or just very long and slow going, right? Those little disappointments where you didn't show up when you said you didn't do the thing you said you were gonna do, and that really damages relationships in the long term. And then in a sort of another site of disengagement is when we have to exercise boundaries or even our authority as staff members. We're gatekeepers of resources, right? And so when people see, for example, um, maybe you're familiar with like um there's a participant on your caseload that everybody just really likes, right? And they're able to access resources more quickly or more easily than that person who everybody dislikes because they're always yelling at everybody, right? And so when that level of authority and gatekeeping is present, and it really shows folks that we're not meeting them where they are, but we're seeing them in the context of like other people, and it's not as person centered. Yeah, I think that's what we'll say there. I'm going to kick this over to you, Kalo, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering if the slides are frozen.
Oh no, what are you seeing? I have the lady who's
Yeah, I see
thinking.
process of disengagement still. What do
Oh
other folks?
no.
Hmm.
Okay, wait. Let me just switch the slides again. Go back. It needs to catch up, maybe.
Process of disengagement. Ah, I hear you clicking
Is,
away.
is
Uh,
it moving? It's not moving?
it's not moving. Hold on, I'm gonna try to
No.
pull this up on my end and it's going. This
Sorry, folks.
yeah, yeah,
Technology is biting us right now.
is. And I have it up on another laptop right now for some notes. So I'm gonna get this open.
Oh, is it caught up
Oh,
now? It
yep,
looks
we're there. Yep.
good.
Accountability enabling consequences.
There we go.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, I love to talk about accountability enabling and consequences, actually. But one of the biggest misconceptions about harm reduction is that it does enable our clients to continue with bad behaviors or encourages them to make bad decisions. Um, and we see that a lot, right? In the discourse around safe injection sites, also called overdose prevention centers. Um, the idea that these exist in our communities doesn't mean that people are going to, at an increased rate, decide they want to start using heroin for the first time, right? Or opioids for the first time. It does mean that folks are going to, who are going to already make that decision, are going to be able to make that decision in a way that is safer and ensures that their likelihood of dying is significantly reduced. Um, so I think what it does is allow people to continue making the decisions that they are going to make, whether we label them good or bad decisions or good or bad behaviors. They're going to make the decisions that they make, but have some options to do that in a way that is safer. Similar to our idea of getting in a car. You can tell me how scary and dangerous it is. Sometimes I might need to drive, right? Ryan and I have a training coming up in Montgomery County in a few months, and we have to drive there, right? Could something bad happen? Yeah, absolutely. Are we not going to do it? No. Um, in fact, we might be doing something even more unsafe if we have to like rent a car, right? There's just like all these layers to um, harm reduction and these ideas of what enabling is. There's actually a really good quote in here in a couple more slides about enable. It's not this one, but about enabling that'll come later. I'm not going to spoil it. It's Ryan's slide, but um, yes, I think oftentimes as like helping professionals, social workers, whatever your role is, we fall into this trap of what are we doing to hold people accountable, right? I think very often the answer to me is, well, nothing, because we've talked about already that the idea of natural consequences, right? People are experiencing natural consequences. People know when they've made mistakes that they don't feel good about, or that have pushed them back in terms of like progress they might like to make. And we don't need to be an additional hammer, right? For example, if I have a client who got arrested for shoplifting, there's a natural consequence, I guess, right? They got arrested for a behavior that they did. I don't need to say, "Wow, David, this is awful. You got arrested. This is so terrible. How could you steal?" They went to jail, right? That is all the punishment that that person needs. Um, so when we're thinking about consequences, I think making sure we're thinking about natural consequences is a great way to just be thinking about um, that idea. This quote on the screen might be something that you've said yourself, or a way you've felt, or something you've thought. And I'm sure Ryan and I have felt ways like that sound or feel similar to this sometimes, right? I can't help somebody who doesn't want to help themselves. Um, and you know what? You actually might not be able to get people to do what you want them to do. That doesn't mean you're not able to support them. It means you might be playing a losing game when your goal is to get them to act in a very specific way that you think um, they should be acting or behaving in, right? Um, you will always have something to offer your participants. Ask them how, what can we be doing if this isn't going to work for you, right? And a lot of times what we're saying when we say this is sometimes like they don't feel low enough, right? This person hasn't experienced the worst that they could. So I just have to wait until they do. And that's how people die, right? People die that way. Ryan said earlier that dead people don't recover, and that is true. We don't need to wait for people to be the lowest that they can be before we're able to support them. We don't need to wait for something awful to happen. Um, and then there's a next quote. You can skip ahead, Ryan. This is by Kate Gleason Bachman. We had the pleasure of working with them at Pathways to Housing PA. And now they work for, I forget, but something big and in homelessness.
Kate works for the National Healthcare for the Homeless Coalition.
There we go. A big org, right? Kate says in response to statements that sound like I can't help anybody who doesn't want to help themselves. That it's ridiculous to think someone doesn't want to help themselves. I think if you're saying that about somebody, you haven't really listened to them. You've not done the work of understanding what is happening for them. When people come to you, even someone who's wanting to harm themselves, they're looking for a way to get relief. They're trying to help themselves in the ways that make sense for them at that time. Our role is to help people from that place where they are and help them figure out how they can take steps to help themselves. We help make them safer, help protect them, and help get them to where they want to be. So this really puts the focus on client-specific goals, direction, and autonomy. Right? People do want help. Sometimes it's not the help that you have to offer in that moment.
So Khalil alluded to this a little bit ago, but we want to talk about this idea of rock bottom. And we're doing a little bit of picking right now. We're trying to be a little bit provocative with some of this content because it's stuff that I think I called them cultural scripts earlier. It's just like stuff that we know from living in the world in 2025. But the concept of rock bottom is very familiar to folks that practice abstinence-based recovery services. Um, and so we want to say here that um, we think that this rock bottom idea is linked to the concept of enabling, which we're calling here outdated, right? And to just build on Khalil's last point, it's this idea that participants need to suffer in order to recover, right? And that if we like make people more comfortable in their lives, then they're not going to make a different decision. AKA, if we make them more comfortable, we're enabling them, right? Um, and so, this idea that I'm presenting here can be really challenging for folks that are really committed only to abstinence-based care or perhaps like 12-step models only. Um, and so I guess the like criticism that I'll hurl over the fence here is that rock bottom is a really slippery concept, right? We can only really know when somebody is at rock bottom in the rearview mirror, right? Retrospectively, after it's already happened. It would be really tough to sort of say, I'm at my rock bottom right now. Um, we can sort of look back and say, hey, that was my lowest point. And often you'll hear people tell their recovery stories in that language, right? That was my lowest point and I needed to make a change. But we sort of don't know that until later on when we've moved upwards, right? When we've experienced some growth or change or recovery. We don't often know it in the moment. Um, how do we measure rock bottom? How can others measure rock bottom for us, right? How do I know this is the bottom and it's time to shape up? And we're making the case here that you can't know that right in the moment, right? Um, the other component of this is that if rock bottom was the very best place to recover from, right? If that was always going to be kind of a clear indicator or like the switch that needs to flip, I think we would see much higher rates of recovery for people experiencing poverty and homelessness and who have been wrapped up in the criminal legal system. We would see much greater success rates, I think, for those folks. And the reality actually is that people with more support and resources do better, right? So it's not that it's necessary for people to be at a very, very low point in order for them to recover. Um, what's actually necessary is greater support and resources. And we think that it's possible to offer that greater support and resources through this harm reduction context, rather than saying, you haven't suffered enough yet because you're not at your rock bottom. Otherwise, you would have made a different decision, right? That doesn't um, allow for the reality of, again, people's identities and the stigma that they walk around kind of receiving. It doesn't allow for the realities of just like the setbacks that people are dealing with in their lives, right? Greater support is what's needed. And so while this idea of rock bottom definitely has worked for some folks, I don't know that it's a way that we can sort of plan on, right? Because when we plan on people hitting rock bottom first and then they start recovering, I think what we're planning on is greater and greater levels of suffering um, that we maybe could do more to mitigate. Let me stop there. I wonder if that's how is that feeling for folks to kind of wrestle with this idea of rock bottom? Has this is that a familiar concept that we're talking about? I just want to kind of check in with folks in the audience and see where you're at with anything that we've talked about so far. I'll give just a quick pause while folks type or think or chew on any of these ideas. Also, did you want to add anything there, Khalil?
Yeah, just while people are typing, and Ryan might have said some of this, but um, I we are calling it the myth of rock bottom, but we're not saying that it doesn't exist for people, right? How we exist relationally, like amongst one another and our peers, needs to look different than how we exist professionally, right? So if someone's coming to you and saying, "This moment in my life was my rock bottom," we don't say, "Oh no, that's a myth, that's not real." Right? They're telling us that they've discovered something really true to them, right? We're not saying it doesn't exist. We're saying that from maybe the helping professional perspective, that it's not a healthy idea to hold that we need to wait for somebody to get worse. But we certainly want to welcome and accept that idea when someone's saying, "This is the lowest I've ever felt in my life." Looks like folks are adding to the chat now. Yeah, everyone's rock bottom might look different, right? That's true for sure. I see Jennifer said um, that when they have to deal with courts or possible jail time, sometimes that's very uncertain and unpredictable and can certainly feel like maybe like significantly low for some folks.
Yeah, and I think to add on to Khalil's point, if somebody says to you like, I just had a court date and now I'm going to be headed to jail and that's my rock bottom, 100%, right? Like if somebody is telling you, this is my rock bottom, absolutely. So to Khalil's point, it's not that rock bottom doesn't exist, but I think for us, the context of this training content is around building the therapeutic relationship, bringing more compassion, which is going to build more trust, which is going to enable a therapeutic relationship that moves us in a direction of greater health and well-being, right? And so when we hold this idea of rock bottom as like a key indicator of change, we are sometimes um, that ends up being a blocker for the kind of relationship that we want, where we help reduce suffering, we bring greater resources and support to those challenges. So I think, yeah, both and in that way. Jennifer, thanks for adding that. All
This is
right. Oh, go ahead. Did you want to
oh,
do this
this was
one,
just
Carlo?
um sure, I don't mind.
Yep.
This is a quote that I think is a great quote that is like a response to the idea of harm reduction being enabling for folks, right? So this is Daniel Raymond. He used to work for or currently works at the National Harm Reduction Coalition. And his response to the idea of enabling says, I got into harm reduction to enable people who use drugs. I enable them to feel like they have someone to talk to, someone who cares, someone who respects them and their humanity. I enable them to ask for help and to help others in turn. I enable them to find drug treatment and health care, to reconnect with their families, to rebuild their lives. And I enable people who use drugs to take personal responsibility for their health and their futures. If that makes me an enabler, I'm proud to claim that term. So he's saying, actually, I am enabling, right? But I'm enabling people to survive, get their needs met, pursue health and treatment, that feels good and supportive to them. And then having somebody who cares to listen and field concerns and questions about life, about treatment, about the agency, whenever that looks like. So I think this really sounds like empowerment, right? I am empowering people to live the lives that they want to do and pursue the things that they want to pursue. Yeah, something that I really appreciate a lot.
All right. We kind of touched on this concept a little bit in the last session, and it was on the review slide, although I didn't even talk about it. But one of the kind of key principles of harm reduction is accountability without termination. And I want to say right up front that many of our program structures do not permit like a full realization of this principle. Khalil and I are coming from a background in housing first care. And in housing first, the sort of grace of mistakes and the dignity of like trying things and making mistakes and getting an opportunity to try again is sort of built into the program structure when it's like a high fidelity housing first model. Um, but what we're saying here is that it is possible to hold people accountable without terminating the relationship we have with them or the services that we're providing to them, which is often the case, right? Somebody makes a mistake or messes up, and again, we're like critiquing the abstinence-based model as like the other side of the coin a little bit here, right? Somebody shows up high in their recovery house. I'm sorry, you've broken the rules. You're going to have to find somewhere else to live, right? Um, but we have to remember, while we're emphasizing choice in these relationships, it doesn't mean that people are going to sort of have ultimate choice all the time, forever and ever. They are engaged in a program of care and services where like resources are gate kept in some ways, right? Folks also still have to sign a lease. They still have to pay rent. They still have to kind of adhere to the same responsibilities and face the same consequences as other renters, as maybe ourselves, right? And if they don't do that, it is possible to hold them accountable without terminating relationships. Um, People may get evicted from their apartment for not paying their rent, but is it possible to continue serving them, right? To continue to be a support structure in their lives? Um, and, I guess I think what's happening often is that people mix up the concepts of consequences with accountability, right? From my perspective, accountability means talking, right? It means like, let's have a discussion about what choices you made and how it affected you. The consequences are going to be present, whether I kind of bring them to the table as a program or not, or as a care worker, or as a case manager or not. If you don't pay your rent, you're getting evicted. That's not my consequence. That is like a life consequence that in this system of capitalism is present, right? I used to call that a natural consequence. Right in this moment, I'm saying it's a capitalism consequence. Um, but so one of the ways that we kind of have this conversation is to highlight the discrepancies between people's goals and their behaviors. You say you want this thing in your life. You say you want like stability in your apartment or like a place for your estranged family to come visit you, and yet you're not paying rent. I want to understand those. I want to bridge the gap between those two things, right? And so those are the kind of clinical conversations where that we think can be most effective in actually preventing recurrence of whatever that behavior is, of that risky behavior. Um, People are motivated by me, activating their own value system, their own goals. We talked about values a lot in the motivational interviewing series last month. And here that's a motivational interviewing type conversation. That is an accountability focused conversation. That's not about the consequences that we put in place, right? What gets challenging here is that some of the behaviors that people engage in are not just ones where their own self-determination is at risk, but other people's well-being is at risk, right? And so sometimes there are consequences that we bring to the table that are like beyond natural consequences when we see that other people are being harmed directly, right? That's when your autonomy is extending too far It's okay for you to sort of do things that harm yourself, but when you start to do things that harm other people, there's an ethical problem there for us in the way that we provide care, right? And so harm reduction can get challenging in those ways. And again, thinking about like family, when there are kids present, that's a really tough sort of ethical decision when somebody is like a active substance user, the parent, for example, right? And there are kids in the home, and we're providing care in the context of a supportive housing setting. So that sort of way that we gauge people's self-determination, that bodily autonomy that we talked about as so important, against the other people's well-being is a really important thing to explore. We've been talking about natural consequences already a little bit, right? Oh, Khalil, I moved on from the slide. Did you want to add anything? I saw you had been unmuted.
No.
Okay, cool. Natural consequences. Let's talk about what they are. We talked, and maybe this is a little bit just repetitive, but folks are still accountable to the consequences of their actions. Harm reduction is not like a free pass to never experience consequences. And in fact, we are not powerful enough to make that true, right? As case managers, as recovery workers, as program staff, it's not possible to protect people from all of the consequences of their actions, but it might be possible to protect them against things that are going to be sort of permanent, damaging, and possibly fatal things, right? It's why syringe service programs are focused on reducing the spread of HIV and hepatitis, right? Bloodborne pathogens. Um, those things are permanent, right? It's not just like you've been evicted, but we've got another apartment that we might be able to get you in next month. That's it. You have HIV now, right? And potentially, if that's not cared for, so many other problems. And so what we're doing when people experience natural consequences is we are offering support. How can I help you now that this has happened, right? What support do you need now? Not sheltering people from the consequences. Let me step in. I'll talk to the landlord and get you like unevicted. Again, we're not powerful enough to do that, right? Now, I might have a conversation leading up to that eviction where we try and put a safety plan in place or something like that, but I'm not going to be able to sort of pull back, rewind time for that consequence. So we're not taking over in times of hardship. And in fact, that might be worse for the participant, right? Where we step in and do everything for them and protect them from all of the consequences of their actions. That doesn't allow that dignity that we've been talking about, where people get a chance to make a mistake and learn from that mistake and grow. The dignity of risk, we called that last session. And so people have an opportunity to practice decision making, get better at it, and move closer to their goal set. In the housing first context, we've seen that so frequently where people around in the program that Khalil and I used to work in, around 30% of people would lose their first apartment through their own sort of decision-making processes and natural consequences. We had the opportunity to then rehouse them, and about half that number lost the second apartment. And more and more people were able to like stick and stay for a long term, greater than 5 years, often in that third apartment. So people got better at the decision making process because we weren't sheltering them from all of those consequences, but we were still showing up for support. So yeah, the next steps belong to the participant. They've made a mistake. We've provided some support. What's next? And we do want to kind of note here that like this change is not overnight. You made a mistake today that enacted a consequence, and now you're going to like do it better tomorrow. Change is long term, right? And we're talking about long term health and wellness. And so this may be like add up to a bunch of failures over the years. But regardless, we're not removing those supports. We're not terminating. We're not firing our clients. And always kind of providing that help.
Awesome.
I'll just wrap up this whole section really quickly, though, by just saying that, like, why are we talking about this? Again, reframing. What are we doing here? We're talking about things that get in the way of the therapeutic relationship, right?
Yes.
These consequences that we heap on, or we don't provide appropriate support when people experience natural consequences, that's going to get in the way of the therapeutic alliance. Sorry, Khalil, go ahead.
No, it's I actually forgot I was on unmuted and I was just like cheering you on kind of. But um I have a few examples come to mind of just some additional natural consequences because when we do think about it, it is hard to like think about what those look like because the idea of an eviction, I agree, is definitely a capitalistic consequence, right? Not necessarily a natural consequence. We've maybe made it a natural consequence with how we view housing and what it means to be housed. But I think some other examples are like what it looks like to lose a key. If you or I lose our keys to our house, there are some natural consequences there. I've done this in my own life many times. I misplaced many things. That's like how my brain is operating right now. And I have two friends that have like additional keys to my home because this happens, right? Now, if I lose my keys or I lock myself out, the natural consequence is I have to call my friend for a key, right? If my friend's not available, guess what else I have to do? Now I have to wait for my friend to be available to have that key. And you know what else I have to do? Cancel my session that I had lined up or do a work thing at another time. There's many natural consequences that I'm there experiencing. Now, I mean, I live alone, but let's say I lived with a parent and they said, "Wow, look what happened. You shouldn't lose your key." I'm gonna be like, "Dude, okay. I know, right? All these things happened to me because I locked myself out of my home." And I think that that is an example of what this looks like. We know our participants lose keys too, right? If you don't have an on-call system in your agency that is able to respond to that, a natural consequence um, is waiting, right? And then we support them to create systems that make sense for them in like locating an additional key or making sure we're not locked out or having an alternative plan for when we do that. Another natural consequence I think of is something that takes place relationally, right? If you're screaming at me in my face and being kind of mean to me, I might not want to talk to you for some time. I might need some time and space, right? And I think that that happens naturally in relationships, and that's also something we might be able to consider um, in our helping roles. Is maybe we just need time and space from this participant. We don't have to tell them how awful they are, but that time and space is probably a natural consequence, and also probably leaves space for more healthy repair afterwards. So those are just some maybe more nuanced, but additional examples of natural consequences that come to mind for me. Alrighty, so we want to now move into discussing um, what can we be doing about these things that get in the way, right, of relationships, or to begin addressing and like healing people's own histories of harmful relationships in their own lives. Um, We can move to the next slide, Ryan. One of those things is addressing power dynamics. Ryan and I talk about this a lot, but it's first important that we talk about what power dynamics are, right? So you can go ahead, yeah. So power dynamics are the implicit or explicit imbalance of authority, control, and influence between providers and clients. Now, what this means is that regardless of your role in your agency, you have more power than your client does, right? Because you have the service that they want, that they need, that they're requesting or seeking. So there's a power imbalance there, right? Sometimes when we talk about power dynamics, it can feel a little dirty. But the reason I give this example specifically is because it has nothing to do with your race, your gender, your class, but really just your role in that space as the provider and the person on the other end being the participant. There is a natural power dynamic there that is not in your control, and it's also not your fault that that's your job and that's the situation that they're in their life. Um, and power dynamics are important to be addressing because they reinforce feelings of disempowerment and distrust, right? Which is easy to understand, could be harmful for a relationship or relationship building or getting to know somebody newly. It can also trigger trauma related to systemic oppression or harm. Ugh, this is how every provider has ever treated me in my life, right? Is what that could sound like. And what that does is create some barriers to authentic and effective engagement. We don't want people to be closed off, especially through a harm reduction lens. And in the harm reduction context, we want people to be open and to be talking to us and sharing what's going on in their lives. If we are exerting our power, sometimes that sounds like you need to do this because I said so. Why can't you just do the right thing? Or if you're coming in heavy and hot and saying, you know what, here's our plan, this is what we're going to do, Um, that's a very explicit display of power, right? And isn't even allowing folks to make the decisions that it's not giving people the opportunities to make decisions we even want them to be making, right? We had a lot of ideas of how people should be acting or responding or how we would like them to, but sometimes we don't even allow that opportunity. Um, so that is the work example of power dynamics, right? You come with some power into a service setting because of your role, who you are in that space, and maybe having a tangible resource that somebody might need. Now, there are other power dynamics at play here, right? That do revolve around things like identities. So um, gender, race. There are certainly some things there to be thinking about when it comes to addressing power dynamics. And one of the ways that I think that we can do this is by naming it off the bat. If I'm doing a trauma intake with a participant who tells me about their really intense fear of men, I might just have to ask them what it's like to be answering these questions with a man right now, right? If I have the capacity or the ability or somebody else who I can access to be engaging in this trauma intake so that this person can be more forthcoming and engaging in this trauma intake, more honest, I might be able to do that. And again, that doesn't mean anything is wrong with me as a clinician. I actually think if you can do that, that's a skill. If you can have that self-awareness that you might not be the person for everybody or the healthiest person to be engaging with anybody, and that it could have nothing to do with you, I think that that self-awareness is really valuable and a skill to have and be looping into our work.
I love what you just said there in terms of naming it, and like an added layer that was just coming to mind as you were talking about that is um, the power around who holds information, right? And so when we can be more transparent about what we have to offer to people in that care context, that can be incredibly trust building as well as like power dynamic shifting. I'm thinking about in this, I've been working in like an outreach context lately, and some like case managers know more than others, right, about the housing resources that for folks, for folks who are on the street. And or some of them know just as much as each other, but will only share certain information when they get like certain indicators from people about their readiness for housing, right? As opposed to just sort of saying, hey, here's all the options we have. Sometimes people withhold that stuff for reasons of their own, right? And so that lack of transparency is the power dynamic in action because we're the gatekeepers, right? We have the keys to the kingdom. And when we don't share, for whatever reason, even if we think it's a very good reason, this person doesn't seem to be ready yet for this level of service, so I won't let them know about the housing assessment that they can get. That's an exercise of power dynamics.
Yeah.
Is it always bad that there are power dynamics? No, it's just sort of a fact of it's a fact of life, right? Like these things are present, but it's worth like thinking those through when we see ourselves executing them.
Alrighty. Um, Uncovering implicit bias is one single slide, but I do want to let folks know that Ryan and I have a whole 3-hour training on standby for implicit bias, okay? But in a nutshell, and keeping it to one slide, it's important to know that the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner is what we're talking about, right? So we don't even know. So to say we don't have an unconscious bias or implicit bias in any way is kind of negating the idea of what it is. It should be subconscious, and we should have to do some digging to understand what that could look like in our work. Um, and you know what? I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was walking to get food from like a Caribbean spot that I like to order from and like pick up at a window. And a person just like pulled down their pants to like go to the bathroom, which is a thing that happens when you live outside, right? But my stomach hurt. I was like, what's going on?" You know? And that was not my best like helping professional self. I know that people do that, and I want to have a lot of compassion and empathy for people that are doing this in the world. But I was like, really? By my food? Right? There's an implicit bias here that that is coming into play here. And if I was tasked to work with that person, it might impact how I'm engaging with them. That's a silly, like very recent example, but can take some other forms as well. Another example I like to give, that I think aligns with the idea of it being activated involuntarily is that sometimes when I'm working with parents, that can be particularly difficult for me. Whether I feel like they are a good parent or like a not so healthy parent, it's something that is challenging for me because my earliest social work roles were in residential and homeless youth shelters, right? So my engagement with parents were really impactful during that time for me. So now when I meet parents of children of any life stage, of adults, of like actual children, kiddos, um, I can feel some stuff coming up for me, right? And it might impact how I'm going to engage with somebody on the front end, right? Which can be really limiting to the relationship. So knowing that helps me to do what I need to do for myself when I know I'm going to engage with a participant's parent in some way, right? And it's important to know that everyone is susceptible. We all have this. In fact, we should be acknowledging that we have this so we can be doing the work. And uncovering implicit biases, there's no end to this, right? This is something that we should be doing and thinking about continuously as our lives evolve, as our relationships evolve, our biases might evolve as well. But we want to be consistently looking at how we're treating folks, how we're engaging for folks, how we're feeling, maybe in our bodies, our brains, and our hearts when we're working with particular people or talking about particular subjects too, I think is another um, good idea to be looping into a training like this specifically because when we're talking about harm reduction, we're talking about things that are pretty taboo to be talking about on a regular basis, right? We're talking about significant and severe mental health diagnoses. We're talking about sex and we're talking about substance use, not things that are super fun to talk about and all come with a good amount of kind of stigma and shame attached to them. Um, I'm talking about a lot of bad things, but that first bullet point says that implicit bias can be positive or negative, right? Ryan and I were working on a contract with some other people that involved us potentially being split up and having to train with people that were not one another, right? And I think we both felt like, I have a bias towards Ryan or I have a bias toward Khalil, right? That was a positive one. I would rather train with Ryan than I would with anybody else, right? I think that's an example of maybe what a positive bias looks like and can also make its way into our social work roles or our helping professional roles and who we want to work with, who we give more time to, who we allow to mess up in more significant ways, and who we give less grace to. I think are some more examples there.
I wanted to offer just like two other strategies for dealing with our bias, right? It's one thing to sort of uncover your own bias. You know what? I seem to be biased towards people who use the bathroom outside, for example, right? But it's another thing to actually like root that bias out. And so there are a number of evidence-based strategies related to managing our bias, right? And I love that Khalil said it's like a lifelong process. The first strategy is mindfulness, right? Kind of operating from this place where we're not just relying on our instincts all the time, right? You know what? I feel some kind of way about this person. That must mean that they're bad in some way, right? So being a little bit more mindful, not going through the motions as much in our jobs, right? And it's very easy to sort of say, you know what? I know how to do a home visit. I know how to provide supportive housing services as a case manager. I'm just going to go through my checklist and do my thing. But when we're on autopilot and we're not kind of consciously thinking about the effect of all of our actions, you know what? How are they going to take it when I say this thing? Or what's it going to be like to do this assessment with them? Um, when we're on autopilot, that is a breeding ground for this bias to show up in negative ways, right? So mindfulness is the strategy. I know that sounds very, as Khalil and I like to say, like fluffy. It's like not always that concrete to say to a training audience. Be more mindful, right? But there are a number of sort of mindfulness-based practices, and I think just sort of throwing that out there verbally, you can like look more into that, or you can engage us in our uncovering implicit bias training, and we'll explain that to you. The second way, and this will sound very basic, is called perspective taking. And if you're familiar with just the concept of walking in somebody else's shoes, that's what we mean. And so when we're meeting with new people or familiar people, trying to always put ourselves in their shoes and say, what might they be experiencing right now? How might they be relating to this situation right now? And trying to think of all the experiences that they could be having sort of emotionally, socially, cognitively. Putting ourselves in somebody else's shoes is one way that we can reduce our bias towards them, right? Because they're less othered. We feel really connected to people that we've are able to put ourselves in their shoes. And again, that's going to make us closer relationally. So those are two strategies. We have a lot more to say about that topic, but we will hold our tongues. Um, the sort of next way that we wanted to talk about to repair damaged relationships or prevent damaged relationships in this harm reduction context is managing our own countertransference, right? So countertransference is sort of any emotional reaction or bias or unresolved issue that we, the helper, are bringing to the table in response to a client or a situation, a client situation. And of course, that's going to be influenced by our own past experiences, right? I'm bringing all of my baggage to every single relationship that I engage in, my personal relationships and my helping relationships. And so when I show up with that baggage, it's going to cause reactions. Hey, I really like working with that person because they seem to like look me in the eye and work well with me. Guess what? That's a countertransference, right? That emotional reaction that we have to working with that person that feels positive, that's a countertransference. And so what I want to say here is that um, countertransference is not a bad thing, right? We will experience countertransference, just like Kala mentioned. We are all going to experience bias. Um, it's about how we handle it and how we manage it that is going to enable a supportive and healthy relationship. So, kind of asking ourselves questions about the experiences that we have is one starting point there. Um, and the next thing I'll say is that um, letting these things breathe, letting our countertransferences out into the open and naming them. Starting point would be with our supervisors and with our peers, but doing so in a way that is not stigmatizing to the people that we serve, which is, I think, sometimes a subtle line, right? Oh, they're doing X, Y, and Z, and that makes me feel upset. I can complain about a client and their behavior, or I can be transparent about what I'm feeling, right? So I can say, I feel this way towards this client. Now we can have a conversation about those feelings and why they're coming up and how might I like mitigate that and like where it might be coming from in my past that I might have my own work to do, as opposed to just sort of complaining about a client, right? It could be very easy to allow our countertransference to turn into sort of a negative and stigmatizing conversation that we would have with our colleagues, right? Maybe we're in the hallway at work between our offices and like, I can't believe X, Y, and Z did this again. I can instead show up and say, you know what, I've been feeling really annoyed lately toward X, Y, and Z person. Will you help me talk that out? Right. So it's about naming and about transparency, just as we talked about in the past. And of course, negative countertransference is gonna be a barrier in our relationship building with people, right? Because the participant that you're working with is like trying to fight their way through the jungle of your own emotional reactions that are showing up, right? And so we're not able to meet people kind of directly. Did you want to add anything there, Khalil?
Yeah, I do. Or Ryan mentioned briefly like the idea of like supervision and talking to your colleagues and peers. And I want to make a note that you might have to advocate for that a little bit. Um, I don't think we can say enough like how important like good and healthy like clinical supervision is if you are engaging with people. You need time and space to be able to name instances like, I mean, you might not walk into a supervision session and be like, I'm experiencing a lot of countertransference because I'm working with this parent, right? That might not be what it looks like. But it might be naming some things that like resemble countertransference. I'm working with this person's parent and I'm noticing I'm struggling to like hear anything they're saying because I'm so tuned out, right? Or I'm feeling really reactive to this. Um, Supervision, clinical supervision, especially, I think sometimes within our agencies can um, become very task oriented, which is is necessary. We need to talk about what we're doing, our documentation and these things, but there also needs to be space to make sure we're talking about how you are and how the work you're doing is as a helping professional, right? Actually, the worst clinical supervisor I've ever had in my life had the best frame for like the time we spent in supervision, actually. So we had 20 minutes to talk about practical and logistical things. Um, and 20 minutes to talk about um, clinical things, and 20 more minutes to talk about, and those clinical things being how I'm feeling, how my clients are doing, how I can maybe be better supporting them, and then 20 minutes to talk about things like documentation and scheduling and things like that. So which was a really helpful split because I knew I would have time to be talking about this with the supervisor. So I think you might need to name that. You might need to like regroup. You might need to do supervision in a completely new way to make sure that these things are being made directional and have some place to go, but are important to really be naming.
I want to pause here and just ask folks. We covered kind of three main strategies for removing barriers to relationships. And next session, we're going to talk much more in depth about like what the therapeutic alliance is and how specifically to shape it and grow it. But here, I'm wondering if folks wouldn't mind putting in the chat if you can think of examples of times when either power imbalances or your own bias or a colleague's bias or your own countertransference has gotten in the way of relationship with a client. Maybe you've seen things kind of go the wrong way as a result of either power dynamic challenges, bias, or countertransference. I'll give a moment for folks to respond to that and just anything else you wanted to add here before we get closer to wrapping up. We've got some good Q&A time available still too. So um, just checking in with folks about the impact of those three things in their client relationships and how you're dealing with it. So again, I'll stop talking for a minute and let people check in a little bit. While you're thinking of your own examples, I have an example about a colleague um, whose own bias really was challenging to client relationship. I've been working in an outreach dispatch center where we send folks out to people who are experiencing street homelessness. And one of my colleagues, who I think is pretty cool in general, received a phone call that a person needed some support on the street, and they described themselves so the outreach worker could find them. And they had some fun gendery stuff going on, right? Like a mix of masculine features and feminine features, and they were trans identified. And my colleague like couldn't get off of that. Like couldn't she still dispatched the person out. She still was able to like send care to that person. But I was witnessing like in the office the way that she talked about this person, and it was much more to do with them, the problem with the client, as opposed to her own sense of bias or her own countertransference to that client. And I feel fortunate that I was able to like hear that, because I would have been quite upset if, for those reasons, she didn't dispatch outreach correctly or didn't offer the kind of services or care that were needed. But it was interesting to sort of like witness that bias show up like very immediately right next to me, and challenging to experience also. I'm not seeing anything come in the chat. Maybe you've never been at the blunt end of a power dynamic situation, but I doubt it. So
Mhm.
I'll keep it moving.
Yeah, I can give one more example, something I've also experienced in my um, I also do some random dispatchy stuff like Ryan. We're just doing what we can to pay our bills, right? But I one time was dispatched to a school in the school district that I live in, and I was a part of like a clinical team where I was the outsider. They didn't know me, but they were already a team, and we got through some introductions and things like that. And I normally don't introduce myself with credentials, right? I tell people I'm a therapist because that's what I do and that's who I am. And like 45 minutes later, somebody asked me about my license, and I told them I was a licensed clinical social worker. And this person, like older than me and differently licensed than I am, just like kind of screamed out loud and said, "You're an LCSW?" And I said, "Yeah." I don't, I wasn't sure how to respond, right? Um, I think that might actually be an example of a potential microaggression, right? Which is also what countertransference can look like. Whose hair do we want to touch, right? How are we engaging with people in these smaller and nuanced ways that might signal something potentially harmful and damaging to a relationship, right? Um, just another example that comes to mind for me.
Alrighty. So we are ready to kind of wrap it up on this home stretch here. I'll offer some key takeaways from our session today, and we're so excited to kind of dig more into next session, the Therapeutic Alliance. Again, how to grow the Therapeutic Alliance, the importance of it, and some data even that shows that. But in terms of today, want to emphasize that maybe more traditional or abstinence-focused treatment models are definitely going to work for some folks, but there are some folks that get left behind in that way of working, right? And so this maybe more relationship-focused harm reduction way, we think can fill some of the gaps there, right? Or can meet some people where they're at who haven't always been met. We are still able to have accountability conversations with folks. Accountability doesn't go out the window just because we don't care that people use drugs, for example. Maybe that's not even the right way of saying that. I do care that people use drugs if it's harmful to them and it's not serving them, but that's not my focus, right? My focus is on like greater health and well-being in whatever ways that can show up. And so sometimes there is a need for accountability, but it's possible to offer that accountability without ending relationships, without ending services and care. Relatedly, folks are still accountable to the consequences of their actions. Um, those natural consequences are not going to always be preventable by us, and that might not even serve them well to prevent natural consequences. In all cases, we do want people to have the dignity to grow and change and make mistakes, and we do still want to show up and support even in those mistakes. And then lastly, addressing and preventing broken relationships is always going to start with us, right? So much of this is not about like the thing we do, the intervention that we bring to the table, but it's how we show up as people, as helpers, with all of our humanity. It's how we activate our power, which is going to exist, right? There's no way around that. It's how our biases show up and whether we do anything to address them. And it's how our countertransference shows up and how do we address that, right? So these are some basic ways that we can address the us of it all so that we don't get in our own way in having kind of a healthful relationship with the folks that we serve. Yeah, so those are our key takeaways. I'll offer some next steps here. We're hoping that folks would complete the session evaluation and give us a little bit of feedback on this session. As a reminder, there are 2 session evaluations. Laura from the Coalition of the Homeless is going to offer us a session evaluation that you'll get. And here's our session evaluation. If you complete that, it'll be an opportunity for us to get some feedback from you, as well as an attendance certificate that'll get generated automatically. So you'll get that. And then I wanted to offer some quick ideas for practice. Wanting folks to look at the possibility of examining the relationships that you have with your clients who engage in stigmatized behavior, whether that's drug use, whether that's maybe having mental health diagnosis and deciding not to take medication. Right? Maybe it's a person who engages in gambling or sex work, some risky behavior, and start to explore what that relationship looks like. Are there power dynamics present there that you could shift? Are there places where you may hold some unconscious bias in that relationship? And is there any countertransference that comes up when you think of that person, right? That really challenging case. And how do we shift that? How do we shed light on that? How do we name it and make it more transparent? So those are our ideas. Again, the session evaluation link is in the chat. We're looking forward to connecting with you for the final part of the series in 2 weeks. That's not next week, but 2 weeks from now on Wednesday at 12 noon. Yeah, I think that's all we have to offer there. Thanks so much for your time, folks. Happy to stick around if folks have questions, by the way, also. But thanks
Likewise.
so much for being here.
I'm going to leave this up for a couple of minutes, make sure everybody gets the links, and then I'll log everybody off. Thanks, Ryan and Khalil.
Thanks,
Thanks, Laura.
Laura.
See you soon.
Thanks, everybody.